Alright, let's get started. So this specific video was meant to be a supplemental tutorial to the arm wound series that I recently put together. If you haven't watched that, it doesn't really matter. Basically, it's a reveal shot, so as this gauze pad is pulled back, it reveals some kind of growing wound. So in the series, we did all the effects in 2D with After Effects, but by using Paint Effects, we can come up with a wildly different result, and it opens up a lot of different possibilities using 3D effects rather than just 2D effects. So let's take a look at how this scene is set up. We switch over here to a perspective view. So basically I just have a roughed in arm that matches up with my arm in the scene, and then we have just a tabletop surface. This is really simplistic geometry. It's just something that we can use to put our paint effects on. We're going to do most of this in the perspective view. It's just easier to work with. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the grid, so that's out of the way. So to get started with Paint Effects, you need to either load in the shelf or you can load it through the Generate menu. If you want to do it through the shelf, if you don't see Paint Effects listed up here, you go to this little gear icon, go to Load Shelf, and then you're looking for the Shelf Paint Effects, which is this first one here. If you don't want to load in the shelf, you can access your Paint Effects through the Generate menu. So just be on Modeling, Generate, and then you can go down to Get Brush. So Get Brush opens up the content browser, and the content browser is basically just a collection of different Maya animation presets, effects. You have scenes, you have models. You also have a collection of paint effects as well. So paint effects, if you have not used them before, might seem a little bit strange at the beginning because there's a whole heap of just absolutely random categories. I actually hear quite a lot of criticism on paint effects by people who don't really know how to use it all too well or don't really understand the purpose of paint effects. And they'll always bring up, why would you ever want a hamburger? And you can see, you can grab a hamburger and you can make a hamburger. And if we focus in on this, minimize this for a second. Yeah, I mean, this is a terrible looking hamburger. It's not useful really at all. If you were doing this for a modeling class or something, you'd probably not pass the class. It's very poor. But the idea of Paint Effects is not to use all of these mel scripts as is. And that's what they are. They are just a mel script that helps you grow specific shapes and animate them along paths. So you need to think of Paint Effects more as a collection of templates that you can use to build upon and then create your own desired effect. So this hamburger might be useful if you need something that has lots of different cylinders that can all kind of stack on top of each other. Not really sure what you would specifically use these hamburgers for, but they're just examples of things that you can use. For this specific example, like something growing on the arm, folders that are pretty useful here are going to be the Fun. So Fun has some pretty random looking things, but you can get things like a feeding creature, for example. If you just draw this out, you can kind of see that there. And one of the other cool things about Paint Effects, it gives you a lot of different channels. For example, ones that add a little bit of turbulence. It makes it look like these are always kind of moving around or undulating and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Anytime you add a paint effect here, it's always going to give you a curve. So clean up your outliner by removing those unused curves. There's also really useful ones in flowers and flowers mesh. Along with underwater, you can get things like coral. The coral is pretty cool. And so are these anemone branches. Anything like this you can use to make it look like there's some kind of weird growth on the arm. I think for this first part of the example though, I'm just going to go ahead and use either plants or plants mesh. So I think plants actually has a pretty good one here, this vine gray bud. So I'm going to use this. I'm just going to minimize the content browser. And basically the way you start, you simply click and drag. So what Paint Effects is actually doing here, it's allowing you to draw a curve, a manual curve, and that curve is always hidden by default. So if you want to see it, you just go up to Display, Show Selection, and you can actually see the curve. And then on the curve, it gives you a stroke. So the stroke has some basic parameters. The most useful ones are going to be an end bounds and the normal direction, as well as this display quality. So by generating paint effects, you often are generating hundreds of thousands of vertices once you convert them into polygons. Let's say you're looking at a field of grass. You can lower the display quality, so this is useful to do. You can also do things like animating the min and max clips to make it look like it's following a curve. However, I don't recommend this if you want to use actual animation for it. It has its uses, but you can see how these just kind of pop on, which is not very realistic. So there's an alternative to this that we'll discuss in a little bit. And there's also the normal direction. So the normal direction is really useful if you have paint effects drawn on a specific object and you want to make sure that the paint effects are facing the correct direction. Most of the parameters that we'll actually be using though are actually going to be in the node that is the name of the brush. This one's called Vine Gray Bud. This is our brush, and there are hundreds and hundreds of options in this. So to begin with, we have a global scale, which is quite useful, so you can kind of make everything larger or smaller. You can also do this with the brush itself as you're drawing it. So if you draw this out and you realize you want this to be quite a bit bigger, if you hold down the B key, you can actually make the brush larger. And by making the brush larger, you also make the paint effects a lot larger as well. Just wanted to mention that in case you guys didn't know. So I'm going to go back now and just select this, go back to my Vine Gray Bud, and then we're going to open up Brush Profile. So this first option here for the brush width, let's say I increase this to something like 5. This is a control of how these individual paint effect objects are dispersed along the curve. So it basically allows you to be a little bit more spread out if you want it to be. This is very useful for things like grass or more natural looking effects, not if you want it to specifically follow a curve. Next, we'll go down into tubes. Now, the way paint effects actually works, if we look closely in here, these are basically just cylinders. Or some of them are really, really low resolution cylinders, so it's just going to appear as a triangle, an extruded triangle. So you can have tubes that grow on other tubes, and if we open up the creation tab here, we have things like the tubes per step, so how many of these are actually being created along a curve. You can change that. We also have segments, so this is something that we'll have to come back to later. This is very important if you are trying to make something very, very realistic. If the object has to curve or curl around or like bunch up. This also generates a lot of polygons because eventually you will probably need to convert these into polygons in order to render them properly. We have things like minimum lengths and maximum lengths, so we can pull those out and pull them back. And then we have tube widths and things like that. For example, on width scale, you can also control the starting and ending position per tube. So if I wanted the start of the tube to be quite wide and then the end to be really thin, you can just pull that down. And you can add as many of these points in as you want. You have quite a bit of control, and you can do this with other attributes, not just width. So look out for these little boxes, they're quite useful. Next, we'll go into growth. And growth allows you to choose other tubes to grow on existing tubes. For example, certain paint effects will already have all of these on. Trees, for example, will automatically have twigs and leaves on, and flowers can also flower from leaves. Now, you can add all of these things, and by doing this, you're going to have to go into each one of these folders and then play around with like the number of flowers or the petal lengths and the overall size of the petals and things like that. If you are making this from scratch, there's quite a lot of things that you will have to change. Otherwise, it's sometimes easier just to choose another template and move on from that template rather than trying to do it from scratch. So we only have branches selected in buds, so I'll just open up buds and branches. So in branches, we have things like the number of branches per tube. So if you wanted something very, very congested, you can increase the number of branches or the start branches and the number of branches as well. You can do things like that. Now, anything you do here, you can easily overwhelm your computer and the viewport as well. So just be careful with cranking these values up. You can sometimes even crash your computer. So always a good idea to save before you go ahead and make a lot of changes. Now, the behavior tab has some really useful channels as well. For example, we have things like displacement, so we can add wiggles to these. You can add some kind of noise as well. So as things are moving around, they're going to jitter more. We also have forces. So forces allow you to control how closely they follow a path or an object or the surface that they're drawn on. You can also randomize them so they're all just kind of going in a more sporadic, chaotic way. We have things like surface collisions and deflections, which we'll look at a little bit later. Then we have turbulence. So we can do things like automatically allowing paint effects to like sway, basically, as if there's like wind. We have spiral control, so you can get things to kind of wrap around a spiral. And one of my favorites here is actually bend. So bend is really useful if you wanted something to unfurl or look like it's shriveled up. Now, all of these channels you can animate. You can do something like things are curled up and then they'll unbend themselves essentially throughout the animation. So we'll have a look at that a little bit later. And then there's a lot of other options. The only other option that we're going to be using is this flow animation. And this is what's going to allow us to follow the path in a more natural way. So it will begin growing from nothing, and then as the tube spreads out, other little tubes will emerge from that, and we'll get a pretty interesting animation. The next part is, how do we actually get this on the arm? And there's a few different methods. We'll kind of go over all of those. So let's go back up to generate. I'm actually going to undock this. We'll be referencing this menu throughout the tutorial. So the first option is select the geometry and then select Make Paintable. So what Make Paintable does, it allows you to draw specifically on that object with a few caveats. So let me grab a new paint effect here. And I'm going to start drawing on the surface, and this looks like it's great. And then as soon as I let go, for some reason, all of the paint effects go into this little corner. And this has to do with the UVs. So this example is not UV'd. If I select the object, go up to my UV editor, we can see that this is not at all UV'd. So in order to use Make Paintable, you really do need to make sure that the object that you have is UV'd. Let's go up to UV and just do some automatic map. And then I'll quickly sew these seams together. You can now see as we move this around, the paint effects is moving as well. If you want a paint effect to go over specific seams, you do need to make sure they're sewed. Otherwise, you'll get like a break in your paint effects and you won't be able to actually cover two different seams. So just make sure that you think about how you want to actually apply the paint effects to your object. So let's go ahead and try that again now that this is UV'd. And now you can see that as I paint along this, it's now snapping directly to the arm. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Another option here is to go into the generate menu again and then have a look at the auto paint. So auto paint comes with two functions. One is grid random. This allows you to add 4 paint effect curves per UV span. This is actually quite high for something like this. But if you had, let's say, a field and you wanted to cover it in grass, this might be an option for you. I'm actually not going to do this because this is going to be a ridiculous setting. It might actually crash the viewport. There's also paint random, and paint random will just randomly place paint effect curves along the surface. So this would be useful if you wanted some trees in a field or something like that. With both of these, you definitely need to save before you go ahead and play around with these, because if you're not really sure what it's going to do, you could easily end up with Maya crashing and you losing progress. What we're actually going to do though is add this to our own curve. Just as you drew your paint effect brush before on a curve, you can actually specify an existing curve and copy paint effects onto that curve. So for this, I'm going to go to a top view, and then we're going to go over to curves and surfaces. I'm just going to grab an EP curve tool, and I'm just going to do something pretty simple. Go into my wireframe area here, and you could do something like this. Just keep it really simple for now, then click enter. Next, you'll want to make sure that you go to a perspective view and just pull this up and make sure it's above the object just so you can see it more clearly. And then we'll go back to the top view and then select the geometry. So with both the curve and the geometry selected, we'll go up to Edit Mesh and then Project Curve on Mesh, then select the option box. So if you go to the top view and you're projecting from the top view, you can just say current view direction, that's easier. And then just make sure that is set and then say project and close. And let's go back over to our perspective view. So basically what we've done, we've just projected a curve on the surface of the geometry, but these are referenced. So as I move over that original curve, you can see that the other one is moving as well, which is really, really useful. So at any point we can change the curve and the paint effects on this curve will also update. So we can do things with animation, or you can just swap out different curves. Let's say you're working on a project and the client really doesn't know what they want yet. This is very easy to go back. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, this was smooth shaded. With the project curve option, it's only really using the hardened edges. So just do keep that in mind. If you wanted to make sure this was a lot more smooth, you'd want to go and physically smooth the geometry first. For this example though, it's not really going to be an issue, and I'm just going to keep it as is. Let's take this reference curve up a little higher just so it's out of the way, and then we'll go ahead and add this paint effect to our curve. The easiest way to do this is to select the paint effect, and on the generate menu, let's go over to get settings from selected stroke. And when you click these, you don't get any feedback that they've done anything, so just be aware. And then you want to select the new curve, that projected curve. And then you want to go to curve utilities and then attach brush to curves. And now you can see that that same paint effect with all those settings that we just did have now been applied to this. Now by default, this is probably not going to be what you want. So let's select this stroke, and we need to go to the actual stroke shape. Go into the normal direction and then just say use normal. So it's now going to use the correct direction. There's a couple of other things though, like we can see that we're losing probably nearly half of our detail underneath the surface. So that's not very good for multiple reasons. So we'll get a lot of clipping, and we're also just wasting polygons when we finally convert this. So let's go to the brush node, scroll up a little bit here to the forces tab. Forces is underneath behavior, so just make sure that is also open. And then we want to click on deflection. And then you can see that we're only getting very minimal clipping. You can also increase the minimum deflection up a little bit if you wanted these to definitely never touch. There's also an option for surface collision. So right now, the paint effects are simply on that curve. It has no idea that there's geometry involved at all. So if you want to make sure that it is aware of the geometry, all you do is shift select the geometry it's painted on, and then select Make Collide from the Generate menu. So now, when we go back into Brush Forces, you can see that Surface Collide has been checked. And if we did something like Surface Attract, you can see these are now being pushed towards the surface. So it's quite useful in that regard. We've now made our curve, and it makes sense when you think about this to actually start at the origin and move outward. But what we've actually done, we would need to do that in reverse. So as you can see here, that this is actually starting in the middle of nowhere instead of the center of our wound. So unfortunately, you would have to remove your paint effects, which is slightly irritating. But we can just remove the paint effects. So let's select the curve, go up to Curves, and then Reverse Direction. And then this is going to keep the original one, so we can just delete the original one. And then basically just do the same thing that we just did by taking the paint effects, get settings from selected stroke, selecting the reversed curve, curve utilities, and then attach brush to curves. And now this is going in the correct direction. Then we just need to use normals again, select our arm, and then just say Make Collide. So if you remember from previously, we went into the brush options, and then in forces, we did have deflection on if you want to use deflection. Anytime you actually select Make Collide, you are actually colliding the surface that way. So just to show those features, I have deliberately done some stuff incorrectly just to show you how to fix them, because I think they're pretty common mistakes. So that's why we did that. All right, so the next thing is getting this to actually animate. So I'm actually going to take down some of the starting branches here. Let's just pull these down a little bit. And then also I'm going to go all the way up to the top here, go into the tubes per step, and I'm going to take this down to something more like 1.5. That should be pretty good. If we want this to start flowing from this point onwards, we need to go all the way down to the bottom and open up flow animation. So flow animation is a little bit tricky sometimes to use just because the viewport often doesn't display it properly. So in order to enable this, enable time clip and then the stroke time, and then you need to have a flow speed. So now you can see that it's got rid of all of the paint effects, and now we're just seeing these splines. But this doesn't really work properly. So as we scrub backwards, you should see these growing, which often that's not the case. They just don't actually display in the viewport. And if you were to start this at the very beginning and just re-enable these settings, everything disappears and it's like it's deleted. So what you have to do in order to get this to work is you have to convert it into polygons. So we'll go up to Modify, Convert, and then we're looking for Paint Effects to Polygons, and then select the option box. By default, quad output is not selected. It generally doesn't really matter if you have it enabled or not. I personally prefer it in case I do want to make any modifications. It is easier, but honestly, Paint Effects is going to give you so many polygons that is probably not really going to matter either way. And then the next is the polygon limit. By default, it caps the polygons at 100,000, which seems like a lot. And if you're on a laptop or you're on a lower end PC, you do need to keep in mind your poly limit. But for very, very intricate and dense paint effects, you will very quickly just run out of polygons, and then it will look like something went wrong in the conversion process. Because as soon as it hits 100,000, it just stops converting them, and then it just ends your paint effects wherever that happens to be. So in order to avoid that issue, if you are on a powerful enough PC, just set this to 0, and it just means that there is no polygon limit. Then select Convert. So when you select Convert, and then you play this back, you can see that the vines are now growing along the surface in a much more realistic way than they were before. So this actually starts from almost nothing, and then you see other tubes emerge. Right now, they're not emerging on any main vine. They're just kind of emerging from that curve. So we'll go and fix that a little bit later. But that's essentially how you get that to work. Another misconception with paint effects is as soon as you click Convert to Polygons, you can't go back and edit that. And it's completely not true. So if we go back into the brush parameters, and just as a note, you'll see that a shader has been created. So you can swap these out to like V-Ray materials or Arnold materials or whatever you want. Let's go back to the Vine brush node here, and I can make pretty much whatever change I want, and I'll see it automatically update in the viewport. So it just basically just reconverts it each time. So if I decided that I wanted even fewer steps, I can do that, and then you'll see that other ones have disappeared, or I can increase it, and you can see that more polygons have now appeared. I can go down into the segments, and if I think this is too high poly, I could reduce the segments down to something like 24. This is the most important part though, because as you reduce the segments, you are actually making the animation and the paint effect look radically different sometimes. You just want to make sure you don't have like way too many. Definitely keep this number as low as possible, especially if you have a lot of animation going on. But what we can do now is some more meaningful animations. So what I'd like to do is use this bend, and I'll have everything kind of curled up, and we're not going to do any fancy expressions here, but we could if we wanted to. Let's just right click and then just set a keyframe, and then we'll come forward, and then we'll let these kind of unfurl as the animation progresses. So actually now looking at this again, I see that I do actually require more segments. So at any time I can go back up and just put that back to what it was. And we haven't lost anything, everything just updates in real time. We could also add some extra forces here. We could add gravity, for example. We could always have gravity being used. We wanted to make sure that those were kept closer to the ground, something like that. So let's now go ahead and make a main center vine for this, because right now it doesn't look particularly good that the vines are just kind of sprouting in midair. So now what we want to do is basically just go back to this reference here. And if I just want all these little branches to go away, all I have to do is go back into the main brush. We can disable tubes and then everything disappears. And then on the brush profile, on the brush width, all we have to do is just pull that up a little bit. And now we have just one large tube. So let's select that tube, select Get Settings from Selected Stroke. Then you want to select in the outliner the projected curve, curve utilities, and then attach brush to curves. So let's pull this back to the starting point here. I'll go into my vine bud here, and I'll just call this center tube. Then we'll go and add flow animation to this again. Flow speed, don't forget to change that so it's at least 1. And we have the same issue that we need to convert this into polygons. So modify, convert paint effects to polygons, option box. This will be the same, so just click OK. And then now this will start sprouting. And because this is moving so slowly, we might consider actually increasing the flow speed. So it's always going to be ahead. Might just lower that down a little bit. It's always just ahead, something like that. And then we can go ahead and just make this a lot smaller as well. We lower that brush width. And by doing that, we are going to just need to modify that flow animation again to just pull this up. But now it looks a little bit more natural that these other vines are coming from a main vine. So if you get really close, you can definitely see that they're clipping, but most of the time you wouldn't really notice that. And it looks like we might actually need to increase that a little bit more. So you just have to look and just see how your animation works and then just tweak it accordingly. You could also, for something simple like a tube, instead animate the min max clip, which might be a little easier. The only thing with this though, you're not going to get that tapered point at the beginning. At this point, you could now combine this with other paint effects. So we could go back up to our get brush. And we can see what other things that we can have in here. For example, the underwater one has this cool anemone thing. And one thing I realized I forgot to mention earlier, we made this arm paintable, but that means that you can only ever paint directly on that one piece of geometry. So to fix that, if you want to be able to paint on the grid again or another object, you just need to have nothing selected and then click Make Paintable, and then you can draw again. So I can just draw out one of these. We could do something with the length, for example, just make that a little bit smaller, length min. You could have it growing up or something. So you could have kind of vines emerging from this. So we could go ahead and just make this paintable again, draw that on there, and then we can just grab the settings here, get settings, and then apply settings to selected stroke. Go up to center the pivot of this, move this around. You can see how it's adjusting. And you can see this one automatically has some kind of swaying motion to it. So if I select this, go into the anemone, and go all the way down to turbulence, we can see that the wind has been applied here, and we can increase the turbulence, decrease the turbulence, and stuff like that. So the very last thing, just to mention that last command that we just used there, the apply settings to selected stroke. Let's say I didn't actually like that anemone, and in fact, I wanted to try something a little bit different. Maybe instead I wanted this sea urchin. Paintable again, and I wanted to replace that with this one. So you would just select this, go to Get Settings from Selected Stroke, select that again, and then paste, and now that same thing is being applied there. So if you decided that you didn't like these vines, for example, these converted vines, what you can go ahead and do, you can select that polygonal group. So these are going to be in a mesh group right here. You could either hide them or delete them. I'll just hide them for right now. And your paint effects are still intact underneath. So this stroke is selected here. If this is hidden, all you have to do is go up to display, show selection, and then you could do the same thing. So let me grab some other vines. For example, these vine leafy vines, and I wanted to replace them with those. You just go ahead and do get settings from selected stroke, select these, and in order to actually view this properly, you really don't want the flow animation on. So I would just disable that temporarily. And we can see this is what we were working with before. The flow speed just kind of gets rid of all that extra detail. And then you want to do apply settings to selected stroke. And now we've just easily swapped those out to new vines. All right, Paint Effects is really powerful. In a few weeks, I hope to have another tutorial series out where we're actually going to use Paint Effects for another type of project. But I hope you guys enjoyed that, played around with it, and I hope you guys found this useful. All right, so if you learned something, drop a like. If you have any questions, post a comment. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.